Welcome to Moravian Mornings, the podcast where we explore the lives, history, and culture of the Moravian settlers in Wachovia, North Carolina, and the greater Moravian world. I'm your host, Savannah Franz. Today on Moravian Mornings, we'll be building on past episodes about pottery in Wachovia. We'll discuss archaeology, the material record Moravians left behind in their pottery, the lives of some of Wachovia's most iconic potters, and the social importance of the pottery workshops in the community. Joining us for this conversation and bringing his expertise to these subjects is Dr. Geoffrey Hughes. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Geoffrey Hughes. Would you tell us a little about your background and your role as a professor at UNC Greensboro?
Sure. So I am an archaeologist, and I currently teach in the Department of Anthropology at UNC Greensboro. And I teach a variety of courses, everything from Introduction to Archaeology to Archaeology of the Southeastern United States. I have been working in and around the Wachovia tract, in and around Old Salem, since the late 1990s, off and on. And that's what brings me back here today.
So what brought you to the world of archaeology in the first place? And how did Moravians and pottery seemingly become the focus of yours within this very, very vast field?
Yeah, right. So the backstory on little Dr. Hughes. As a kid, my parents always took me to different museums. My grandparents were in the Rockhound Club, and so we used to go out I grew up early on in Southern California, so I used to go out there with my parents and grandparents into the Mojave Desert, and we used to explore some of the old mining towns. So having that kind of just general background in history, historic sites, that kind of set the stage. Of course, most archaeologists will point to movies like Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And of course, yes, that played an important role in kind of my development as an archaeologist. It put archaeology front and center in my mind. But then right after that, I went to the local public library and I started checking out books on archaeology. Often those glossy National Geographic books that were like guides for elementary school kids to talk about archaeology, right? That's what really sold archaeology for me, was kind of looking beyond the movie and looking at scientific publications, popular scientific publications like National Geographic. In college, I majored in anthropology. I was really interested in archaeology, which is one of the 4 subfields of anthropology in the United States, and started working, did my field school in the Bahamas, working on a plantation in the Bahamas. And then when I finished up my undergraduate degree, my advisor said, well, if you're interested in African American archaeology, if you're interested in African diaspora archaeology, you're on the West Coast, you should probably go and spend some time on the East Coast. So I applied to the graduate program at the University of South Carolina, was accepted, and my mentor at South Carolina, by the name of Dr. Leland Ferguson, had actually grown up in Walkertown and remembered going to what's now Old Salem and going to the original Krispy Kreme donut shop. And in the 1990s, Old Salem reached out to Dr. Ferguson and asked him if he would do archaeological work at St. Philip's African Moravian Church. And so that's where I come in as a grad student. I was one of his grad students, and in the late 1990s, I followed him up to North Carolina, up to Old Salem, and worked with him at St. Philip's. And that's when the world of the Moravians became a thing in my consciousness. a group of people that I had never heard about before, had never thought about before, and now all of a sudden, everywhere I looked, there was a Moravian congregation, there was a Moravian church, there was something inspired by the Love Feast or the Easter sunrise service. And I've really never lost that interest in trying to understand the Moravian story ever since.
I can just so relate on those first points of how you became interested in all of this, just with you didn't get lost necessarily in the romance of the movies, but like really going to like the places, the museums, and like the like more scientific books. I was raised by public school teachers, and so every summer we just go around to museums and historic sites and national parks, and it was places like this that just like struck my heart. And then I would go back to like my school library or my public library that I could bike to from my house and just spend hours there like paging through books on like on history, on archaeology, like Nat Geo type books. It was really romantic. And I too, when I came here for Salem College, I did not know what a Moravian was. I'd never heard of them. And even when I was at school there, I was surrounded by the culture. I was literally on a site that is to at least colonial history and to me like women's history. Such a significant location. And still I didn't learn much about it in a structured way despite being a history major. And it took starting to work here to really dive into like who were these quirky Moravians and totally just like fell in love with learning about them because like the one layer you go, there's another layer to it, and very fascinating people.
As someone, I didn't grow up Moravian, I didn't grow up in a Moravian congregation, I still consider myself a student of Moravian history. I'm constantly learning new things, and the complexity, the diversity, the rich history. I'm always learning something new, something that I didn't know.
Yeah. And for people that lived in a very specific, socially structured way for, in a way, a limited amount of time through then like assimilating, like it's sometimes shocking to me how, because of how widespread they were, how similar in some ways all these different Gemeins were, but also how different they had to be based on locale, based on what their goal was. Bethlehem versus Salem. I especially love like learning about Bethabara and Salem just as this crux of as a trades town and the location being in the south. Like the difference between a missionary community and a money-making community is so fascinating to me.
Yeah. I think it's a good illustration of unpacking the concept of culture, right? So as anthropologists, we throw around the term culture all the time. And in general, it refers to all of the beliefs and practices that a group of people engage in and that they pass on from one generation to the next. But what cases like the Moravian examples remind us is that even within groups that share the same broad culture, there is always diversity, there's always nuance and complexity. Cultural groups are not monolithic groups, and different communities have different ideas of what it means to be a Moravian, and different generations have their own ideas and their own take on what it means to be a good Moravian.
What projects have you worked on regarding Moravians?
Sure. So primarily 3 projects. So first, working down at the bottom of Main Street at St. Philip's African Moravian Church and Cemetery. So I worked there during my master's degree. Worked there for 3 field seasons, trying to uncover and relocate particular interments that had been landscaped over top of and hidden in 1913. So that was the first project that I was involved in. And then when I came back to North Carolina to get my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, I reached out to Michael Hartley, who was the director of archaeology at Old Salem, who I knew, and I said, do you have any projects or anything that's going on? And he brought me in on Lot 81, which was the site of the builder's cabin. So the first structure that the workers lived in when they were building and preparing Salem. And so with that project, we spent a summer looking for the foundation of that cabin, looking for where the fireplace was. And one of the things that builder's house had been used for later, it became the workshop associated with the Schaffner-Krauss pottery in the 1830s. And there was an addition onto that builder's house, which was part of the pottery workshop. And when we were excavating, we actually came down on the brick footing for one of the tile stoves that is in one of these photographs of the Schaffner-Krauss workshop. And so then that's why, started thinking about pottery. And I was looking for a good dissertation project at the time. And that's when Michael Hartley and John Larson approached me and said, hey, we have lot 38, which is one of the lots associated with the kilns that were built across from the congregation-owned pottery. Would you be interested in taking a look at that as part of your dissertation research? And I said, okay, well, let me just kind of brush up on Moravian pottery and the potters and who was involved. And knowing that this was a site where Peter Oliver worked, where so many of the Moravian potters from Rudolf Christ onward had worked at that site. So I went back to my dissertation committee and I said, hey, what do you think about this project? And they were like, yeah, we could see that. So part of it is kind of knowing where your interests lie, but then also being pragmatic. You don't necessarily have access to all the archaeology sites that you would like to excavate. And this was a little bit of serendipity, but I think it worked out for everybody.
Certainly. Even after decades of excavations and research, there still seems to be so much we can uncover and learn from. What future projects do you hope to undertake in the Southern Moravian world?
Sure. So I did work at Lot 38 from 2016 until 2018. We uncovered a kiln from 1811, and then we also uncovered what looks like the footprint for Rudolf Christ's experimental kiln that he built sometime between 1793 and 1794. Now, that particular kiln, there wasn't a whole lot that was left. It looks like they demoed that kiln in 1805, and they basically filled in the foundation with pottery wasters, with kiln furniture. It looks like they probably went to whatever waster dump that they had, and they probably just scraped it and put it in the hole to fill the hole in. But it also looks like they went through that original kiln, that experimental kiln, and they dismantled it. And I think they probably were looking for bricks that were still usable that they could recycle when they built its replacement, which was supposed to be twice its size. So there wasn't a whole lot of that kiln left. What we did discover was that that kiln was built into the subsoil, about 2 to 2.5 feet down into the subsoil. And we think that the reason why they did that was they wanted to make stoneware, which requires higher temperatures. So our understanding of Moravian kilns before and after in Wachovia is that they all sat on the ground surface. And ultimately, they weren't really able to generate the kinds of temperatures that you would want for stoneware production. And so it looks like in 1793-94, Christ builds this experimental kiln on lot 38, and it's a semi-subterranean kiln so that he can get those higher temperatures. Again, we didn't find a whole lot of the structure of that kiln left, and I only excavated the northern half. So when I excavated both of these kilns, we excavated half of the kiln. We bisected the kiln so that we could figure out what was the design, but then also save part of that kiln for future generations. So if archaeologists in the future have new research questions, if they have new methods, they can always return to the site and explore part of that kiln in the future. So with the experimental kiln, we didn't see much in terms of its actual structure. So last summer, we came back with the field school and we excavated just south of where I had finished in 2018 with the idea that, well, maybe there might be a corner, a part of that kiln that might still be intact that we didn't see looking at it from the other end, and maybe we could learn something about its structure. And so that's why we came back in the summer of 2024.
Did you find anything?
Well, so we found a feature. It looks like it's part of a vertical wall, perhaps part of an opening. And it is located far enough south and deep enough that it's where we would expect to find the remains of that 1793 kiln. So that's our hypothesis, is that that may be related to that kiln. Now what we need to do is we need to go back. We need to go back, test that hypothesis, see if it really is part of that experimental kiln. So that's probably the most pressing project. But in terms of future work, we know that there were so many potters who learned their trade from the Moravian potters in Salem and in Bethabara. And then they went out and they started their own potteries, not only in Wachovia, but beyond. And so I think one of the things that archaeologists should do in the future is we should follow up on some of those potteries. Look and see, okay, what did the apprentices do? What did their pottery shop look like? What kinds of new techniques or technologies maybe they incorporated in their own production of pottery? Can we see evidence of what they learned in Salem or Bethabara, but then can we also see what they may have learned from neighboring potters as well? So I think that's probably kind of the future of ceramic study in this area.
That's such a great point to bring up, because I've been curious before about, what is the perhaps syncretism from Moravian potters perhaps venturing out, learning from other people, or starting their own potteries, or even perhaps leaving Moravianism, but having this foundation of understanding and also aesthetic motifs. Like, is there anywhere where we can find where that starts to syncretize with other traditions, other aesthetics, other practices?
Sure. So we have a lot of evidence that the Moravian potters were influenced by the outside world. So obviously they're making traditional wares, those coarse earthenwares, utilitarian things. They're also making the beautiful decorative trailed slipware. These are all kind of within the Germanic wheelhouse of pottery styles. Things that Aust had learned in Germany, things that they were making in Bethlehem, the traditional stuff, which they never stopped making. But we see that with people like Rudolf Christ, he's willing to incorporate newer styles. He's still making traditional wares, but now he ventures into what we call the fine ware trade. These would be molded dishes, molded objects that were very popular among British potteries that were being exported to the colonies, exported to the Americas. Things like queensware, royal pattern, feather edge, all these new and fashionable items. So we know that the Moravians are keenly aware of what the outside market is looking for, what will be popular among other settlers in the backcountry, and they're willing to embrace new styles and new techniques into the pottery. We know that they were keenly aware that the potters in and around Wachovia, over time, they were becoming more and more competitive. And they knew that they needed to constantly innovate to be able to attract enough business and keep people coming back to the pottery. So from that perspective, we know that the outside world certainly influenced Moravian potters. Now, the other way around, that's where we need to do more research. We know that the Moravians were exporting pottery all over the place. They were sending pottery to Charleston. They were exporting tobacco pipes to Philadelphia, right? So we know that they're making pottery and they're sending them those pieces all around the place. We don't necessarily know, or we're not necessarily able to identify where those pieces end up. So that's kind of a question there. In terms of styles that other potters may have picked up from the Moravians, that's also difficult because in this part of North Carolina, in the Piedmont, you have the Moravian pottery tradition. You also have the Alamance potters. You have the St. Asa tradition. You have a whole lot of German and Germanic immigrants that are coming into the South. And so there are things that those potters are making that would resonate with Moravians, and things that the Moravians are making that would resonate with other Germanic-speaking peoples. They kind of have a common grammar in terms of decoration, especially these coarse earthenwares, these redware things. Now, there is an interesting case, an interesting site, and that would be the site associated with Jacob Meyer. He was one of Aust's trained apprentices, had worked in Salem, and he ends up down by Mount Shepherd. He opens up a pottery, and the excavations down there show this really interesting mix of Moravian styles, but also styles that look like they're very much influenced by the outside world. So one example would be Meyer made ceramic stove tiles, like any good Moravian potter would, right? Most of the Moravian ceramic stove tiles that we have that are decorated, they tend to be decorated in like Rococo designs, things like that. We usually don't see people or animals on those tiles. But down at Meyer's pottery, he's got a stove tile that has a soldier on the tile. Something that, we know that the Moravians weren't particularly militaristic, and so that's not something that you would normally see on Moravian products, but this is something that we see down at Jacob Meyer's pottery. Another thing that we see some vessels that appear to kind of mimic some stoneware designs, right? So he's keenly aware of what's in vogue around him and what his clientele might be looking for. The other thing that we see at Meyer's pottery is his kiln is different than the basic design of most of the Moravian kilns that we've excavated. Most Moravian kilns are either square or rectangular in shape. Meyer has a circular kiln, something that we see on sites not associated with some of the Moravian potters. And so we've always wondered, where did he pick that up from? How did he figure out to, build this circular kiln? Again, kiln building would have been part of what you learned as an apprentice and as a journeyman potter, right? Because you can spend 3 months making pottery, but if you don't have the right kiln, and if you don't understand how to build a kiln correctly, how to fire that kiln correctly, that's 3 months worth of work that, could literally go up in smoke, So where did he figure that out? That's a question that we have. So I think that line, looking at the kind of back and forth influence between Moravian potters and potters outside of Wachovia, I think that would be a very fruitful line for future work.
Can you take me through what perhaps the daily life or what the experience of a Moravian journeyman or apprentice potter would have been like?
Right. So, you have to remember these are congregation-owned businesses. So the Salem Pottery was a congregation-owned business from its founding in 1771 all the way up to 1827 or 29. And so the first thing is that you would have a master potter who would be a skilled potter that would be in charge of managing the business, and that person would be selected by the church leadership, and there could be only one master potter. Then you would have journeyman potters who had already gone through their apprenticeship. They weren't necessarily masters in their own right, but they would be paid a wage. They knew what they were doing, and they were probably honing their skills, just waiting to go out and found their own pottery. So between the master potter and the journeyman potter, they would have been in charge of teaching the apprentices. And the apprentices are indentured apprentices. So they usually sign a 7-year contract to learn all the ins and outs of the pottery business and the pottery trade. Again, those apprentices would have been selected by the Aufseher Collegium, the church board that was mostly in charge of kind of the day-to-day running of the town. They would have signed an apprenticeship. That indenture would have been, copies would have been given to the master potter. And after that 7-year period, then the apprentice and the master potter would go before the Aufseher Collegium. They would exchange the indenture paper, and the apprentice would be spoken free, quote unquote. That apprenticeship would have involved learning everything that they could about pottery making. And it not only included, or they were not only judged on their ability to make quality pieces of pottery, they were also constantly observed and judged regarding their behavior in the pottery. Were they obedient? Did they really put all of their effort into learning the trade? And then also, how did they behave outside of the pottery? Were they making trouble within the larger community, or were they living up to Moravian ideals? Those apprentices, those journeyman potters, would have lived primarily in the single brother's house. And so one of the things that we see with apprentice potters is they're actually paid a wage. And that wage was set by the church. And out of those wages, things like room and board would be taken, clothing, things like that. We know that Salem, as a congregation town, was very focused on religious observance. And you can read sources like Adelaide Freese, where she kind of outlines what the daily structure of life would have been like. When did they have morning prayers? Are there afternoon prayers, evening prayers? And so you have to imagine that making pottery would have been kind of a balance or a dance between working in the pottery and doing religious observance and back and forth. right? So you're learning not only how to be a good potter, but you're also learning how to be a good pietist Christian in Salem. Now, beyond those are kind of the formal statuses within the pottery. The pottery could also bring in other forms of labor, other people working in the pottery. These would be pottery helpers. And in some cases, the qualification wasn't that you had to have a lot of skill, but that there was a need to employ that person. Maybe they were too old for an apprenticeship, but then they could be brought into the pottery, they could work in the pottery. In some cases, we also have examples where stub stem tobacco pipe making. That was a perennial bestseller in the pottery. They were making them by the thousands. And we have examples of outsourcing some of that pipe production to other members of the community, especially if they were, say, older or infirm and they needed a source of income. Then pipe making was one of these things that they could engage in. The pottery probably gave them the presses, they gave them the clay, and then they could press these pipes in their house, probably bring the pottery pipes or the tobacco pipes up to the pottery. The pottery would fire them, sell them, and then they would give them their cut. So the pottery wasn't just for potters per se. It was also part of this broader moral economy, a form of economic uplift for the entire community. And that's one of the things that we see that kind of distinguishes Rudolf Christ. Rudolf Christ understands that to be a successful master potter, not only did you have to have the skill to be able to make really good pieces of pottery, not only did you have to be a good business person to be able to manage the pottery, but you needed to engage with that broader moral economy. The pottery shop needed to be seen as a source that would help uplift and support the entire community, not just economically, but also spiritually. And so that's one of the things that Rudolf Christ does. He seems to open up the pottery to serve the entire community, perhaps more so than his predecessor Aust did. But even Aust recognized that the pottery needed to do more than just make pots. It needed to be a source of uplift for the entire community.
You've mentioned the social mobility of potters in Wachovia, and I'm curious to learn more about the different ways Moravian potters use their trade to maneuver the socioeconomic ladder of the early South. Can you tell us a little bit more about how potters in Wachovia use their trade to improve their social conditions?
Sure. So I'll start with Rudolf Christ. Rudolf Christ is a great example. So Christ was one of Aust's apprentices, became a journeyman under Aust, but their relationship was rocky. There are mentions in the records of almost all-out fights, at least yelling matches, right? And the church was very much aware of that. The interesting thing that happens is that in 1773, a potter by the name of William Ellis, he's a Staffordshire-trained potter. He was working in South Carolina. Brother Baggy, who was running the community store, meets him in Charleston and brings him up to Salem. Ellis goes into the pottery and he starts showing the Moravian potters how to make this fine ware pottery that we talked about earlier. One of the things that happens is that Rudolf Christ, who by this point is, I think he's a journeyman at this point, he comes up with the suggestion after Ellis that maybe he should specialize in making fine ware pottery. Aust doesn't seem to be too impressed with this British fine ware pottery. Aust was trained in the traditional Moravian Germanic pottery tradition. I think he had a very clear sense of what proper Moravian pottery should look like. And so, to a certain extent, even though these two people had a rocky relationship, Aust doesn't seem to see that as a threat to his own identity. Instead, he ends up agreeing and saying, okay, yeah, go ahead, Christ, make this British fineware stuff. The Aufseher Collegium hears about the proposition, and they basically say, problem solved. They can potentially set up separate shops because Chris points out the fact that if he's going to do this fineware or refined pottery, he needs to keep his clay separate from the coarse earthenware clay. Otherwise, bits and pieces of twigs, rock, all that kind of stuff will get mixed in with his clay. So Christ actually puts in for setting up his own pottery shop in Salem. And initially, the church is on board with this idea. So you would actually end up with two pottery shops in Salem, one doing traditional earthenware, the other one doing this more British fineware. That plan falls through. But what ends up happening is that Chris then goes back to the church and he says, hey, since Aust moved from Bethabara to Salem, Bethabara has not had a functioning pottery workshop. And there are people in and around Bethabara that need pottery. So would it be possible, could I go and set up the pottery shop and reestablish it in Bethabara? And the church says, okay, go for it. So Rudolf Christ goes to Bethabara. He now has this fineware production. He now has greater autonomy. He has his own space. So that kind of helps him with his social mobility. At the same time, Peter Oliver later on is sent to Bethabara to work under Christ and learn the pottery trade. And so for Peter Oliver, who at the time was enslaved, he now has the opportunity to learn a craft, a marketable craft that was in high demand. Now, because he was enslaved, he could never achieve the formal status of an apprentice or a journeyman or a master potter. However, we know from the records that that did not keep him from learning the trade and becoming a very skilled potter in his own right. So Peter Oliver is able to travel from Salem to Bethabara, and Christ and Peter Oliver work together for a short time out here. So they're a little bit further away from the kind of direct church oversight that you would have in Salem versus Bethabara. So there's a little more autonomy there. Ultimately, in 1788, when Aust dies, the church calls on Rudolf Christ to come to Salem to do the inventory of the pottery that was in stock. And then he is set up to become Aust's successor and to become the master potter in Salem. Now, at the time, Peter Oliver was not allowed to come back to Salem, in part because the church really wanted to restrict the number of enslaved people in town. And so Peter Oliver is out here in Bethabara. The pottery business basically gets sold to Gottlob Krauss. And at the time, Peter Oliver is very concerned that Gottlob Krauss won't need him in the pottery and that he could potentially sell Peter Oliver. And so he petitions the church. At this point, Peter Oliver is petitioning the church, and the church recognizes that here you have a devout, pious Christian, a Moravian, and they want to make sure that he isn't just dismissed on a whim. So they ensure that Krauss will not be able to just dismiss him from the pottery and sell him out of Salem, or out of Bethabara. Over time, the relationship between Peter Oliver and Krauss sours. At one point, Peter Oliver leaves the pottery workshop here, and he starts working on a farm that was owned by Samuel Stotz, who was the warden in Salem. And at the same time, he starts petitioning the church to return to Salem and to go to work in Christ's pottery workshop. Through a confluence of events, Peter Oliver is allowed to return to Salem, and he starts working in the pottery workshop in 1796. We think that he worked there at least until 1800, at which point he was able to take some, if not all, the money that he had earned doing day work in the pottery under Christ. He's able to use that money to purchase his freedom. So in that case, you have someone who is using not only kind of the technology of being a pious Christian, how to be a good pious Christian, right? And the technology of pottery production to create greater autonomy for himself, to earn the kind of economic capital that he needs to be able to buy himself out of slavery. And so that's probably the most dramatic case of a potter being able to really change their social position over time. Of course, going back to Rudolf Christ, he ends up becoming one of these celebrated figures in Salem's pottery history. By the end of his life, the entire town looks up to Rudolf Christ. And I think that they look up to Rudolf Christ not just because he was a great potter, but because of all the things he did for the church in addition to being a potter. He becomes one of the go-to brothers. If there's a dispute in the Aufseher Collegium, if there's some contention, it seems like Rudolf Christ is usually one of the names that is mentioned and is asked to go and talk to brother so-and-so, figure out what's going on, talk to him, have a heart-to-heart, and then report back to the Aufseher Collegium. So he's a trusted member of the congregation. At one point, he is supervising God's Acre, one of the most sacred spaces in Salem. He also helped with instructing with musical instruction as well. So, and then it seems like whenever there's an issue, again, like the pipes, if you have older or infirm members, it's Rudolf Christ that you read about in the Aufseher Collegium who volunteers a suggestion. He volunteers a way to solve a problem, right? So he volunteers the pottery to do this or that, to take this person in, to provide a source of income for that person, or to help people who are struggling.
That's so interesting. I did not know that story of his later life, of Christ's later life. Really, the most I know about him is seeing his pottery, and his relationship with Peter Oliver, and his relationship with Aust, which seems to be a spicier one in his early life. Yeah. So knowing that he kind of became this go-to brother, did he also marry Sister O, who was the founder of Salem? That's something I thought I read recently.
So his first marriage, she basically started what would end up becoming the girls' school.
Yes.
Right. And they had several children together, none of whom survived to adulthood. In part, I remember reading one passage, 1792, there was a diphtheria epidemic that swept through Salem. And it really took its toll on many of the young people in Salem. They lost their 3 children to that diphtheria epidemic. That for someone like her, who was probably used to and had an affinity for working with children. Probably had a household that was very active and bustling with little feet running here and there. To suddenly lose those children in that epidemic, it must have been just heartbreaking. And we know that Rudolf Christ, at one point, the records talk about after the epidemic, he was convalescing at a mineral spring nearby, and one of the things that he was doing was he was kind of leading informal services with the other people who were convalescing there. That's 1792. 1793, he expands the pottery from its location on the west side of Main Street to now the east side, and he starts building this experimental kiln. I can't help but wonder if expanding the pottery, if kind of throwing himself back into work, may have been one of the ways in which he personally dealt with the loss of those children during that epidemic.
Thank you for telling me that story. There's so much I don't know about Christ, and like all these fine details, even knowing that Moravians would travel to a mineral spring to convalesce. It just expands that world for me. So, to go back to Peter Oliver, sadly we don't have any pottery pieces signed by Peter Oliver. How can we interpret his life and work as a potter, and what can the archaeological record teach us about all of that?
Sure. So it's very rare that you find, at least during the congregation-owned business period, where you find pieces that are signed by a potter. In part, we've interpreted that as signing your work would be an expression of individualism that would just be going too far. It would kind of undermine the community ideal, and so that's probably why they're not signing their work. So attribution can be very difficult. Most of the time what we can say is that based on the style of a particular piece, it probably came from either the workshop of Aust or the workshop of Christ or the workshop of Holland. There are a few exceptions where you do get like a maker's mark, but it's probably later on. And my hypothesis has been that you probably don't really get maker's marks or signing pieces until they are privately owned businesses and there's more like economic competition. And so you kind of need to sign your work so that people know, come to my shop, not somebody else's shop, right? So the question is, what can the archaeology tell us given the lack of direct physical evidence of things that Peter Oliver made in the pottery shop? What can we learn about Peter Oliver through the archaeology? The archaeology reveals the breadth of pottery types and technologies that the Moravians were making. It reveals the kinds of experimentation that they were doing, things that wouldn't necessarily survive as antiques today. We get a fuller picture of the range of technological innovation that the Moravian potters were doing. The kiln design, we have now a better understanding of how complicated and complex those kilns were. So what we come away with from the archaeology is a better understanding of the level of skill, the improvisation, the creativity, and also the challenges involved in making pottery. From the documentary record, we definitely see ways in which Peter Oliver needed Rudolf Christ, needed to work in the pottery, the ways in which that then helped him achieve his goals. From the archaeology, when we better understand the challenges, the innovation, and the experimentation, and the skill level needed to produce pottery, then we get a better understanding of why Rudolf Christ would have needed someone who was dependable and skilled like Peter Oliver. Saying that Rudolf Christ and Peter Oliver needed each other in no way diminishes from or sidesteps the inherent inequality and exploitation of slavery. But what it does do is it provides a more complex, more nuanced picture of how Peter Oliver skillfully navigated the system of enslavement to eventually gain his freedom and create a meaningful life for himself and his family.
Well, to end, I want to talk a little bit more just about archaeology in general. So why is a basic grounding in archaeology fundamentals important for, do you think, the general history student? As a professor that I'm sure doesn't just teach anthropology and archaeology interested students.
Sure. So I'll answer that by addressing the low-hanging fruit, if you will. So the vast majority of human history predates the written record. And you can really only get at that through archaeology. Now you can do some with genetics, but archaeology is probably the most direct way to get at those millennia of human experience that were not documented, not written down. The next question is, okay, well, in historic periods or in societies where there are written records, why would you need archaeology if you can just read the written records? Well, what we know about literacy is that from society to society, the rates of literacy are different. Early on, some of the earliest texts are written by elites or specialists. And so not everyone in that society was literate. Not everyone in that society could read and write. And so archaeology can kind of fill in that hole. And then there are the periods, especially like the modern world, where literacy over time becomes more and more prized, and more people within a society are literate. They can write about themselves, they can write about their family, and they can leave those records that we can read. A written record is usually what someone says about themselves or what they say about someone else. It's a record of what people said they were doing. Archaeology can often show what people actually did, the things that were left out of the written record. Sometimes those 2 points of view, the historic document and the archaeological record, occasionally they tell contradictory stories. Most of the time they tell the same story from a different point of view. And so usually the most rewarding relationship between history and archaeology is when we combine them, when we blend them together. Then we come out with this really rich, nuanced understanding of the past. Archaeology is very good at exploring the relationships between people and things. People in the natural world, people and animals, people and plants. One archaeologist in the 1960s, Albert Spalding, he actually thought a lot about this question. What makes archaeology unique? There are these other disciplines who study the past. What is it about archaeology that is unique? And he basically argued that archaeology is a particular perspective on the past, and that archaeologists look at the past through 3 simultaneous dimensions. We look at the past through time, through space, and through form. And ideally, we should look at our data with those 3 dimensions in mind. So the form of an object, what it looks like, all the different varieties of that thing, how it was made, the materials it's made out of. Time, how does that object or those objects change over time? what's the history behind it, and then space. How are they distributed across the landscape? What are the different varieties of particular artifacts? So if we look at Moravian pottery, for example, all right, we want to understand what are all the different varieties of that pottery. We want to understand the history of the pottery, right? Why did this particular form, how did it get to be the way that it is when we find it? And then how is it distributed across space, right? Are they making the same kinds of pottery in Bethlehem that they're making in Salem? What are the commonalities and what are the differences, right? So for someone like Spalding, he would argue that archaeology, in addition to some of its unique methods like excavation, that we should go beyond just conflating the method with the discipline, that we should actually see the discipline as a particular point of view on the past.
I love that. I especially think it's so interesting when thinking about what I consider an attempt at like a utopian project within Moravian communities. And when we read about Moravians, and even here when we interpret about them, it can be so easy to just get lost in being like, these are the things that they wrote down, these were their rules, this is how they lived, and that means that that's exactly how every single human being functioned.
Yeah.
But the material record shows and helps us understand that that isn't necessarily true. At least it helps us grasp an understanding of that, of just because everyone was supposed to consult the elders and the lot for marriage, that does not mean that people did do that. There's just so many perspectives that can be taken on history beyond just the written record, especially in religious communities where rule following is the dominant form of like how people are supposed to function, but these are human beings. That is not necessarily how they function.
Yeah, I think ideally the relationship between history and archaeology should be, in an ideal world, that what you learn from the archaeology should help you better understand the documentary record. And what you learn from the documentary record should help you better understand what you find in the archaeological record. A great example would be, like you mentioned, these ideal and planned communities where they're laying down regulations. And what we see is that a lot of times those regulations are written down because they are in response to what people are doing. Sometimes church leaders revisit issues and they feel the need to clarify things, right? Well, they're responding to what people are doing on the ground. And archaeology can show us what they were doing on the ground that the church leadership then feels the need to respond to. And so you can then better understand the context around that historic document, and those historic documents can then help you understand the context around the artifacts and the features that you find. It's really a dialectic between those two.
Good word. To wrap up, where can we learn more about your work? Where can we read it?
Sure. So I've started publishing some journal articles. And some of these are not behind paywalls, which is always a good thing. So, for example, the Mesda Journal, right? So I was fortunate to write an overview of Peter Oliver's life. That is available to the public. You can go online and you can read that article. The dissertation, I'm going back through my dissertation and I'm looking for potential articles to come out of that, ways of spreading that information in written form. I always try to engage with the public whenever I can. And so public talks. I try to make myself available for that. The podcast. And I'm hoping to maybe do some more online engagement in terms of my own research. So hopefully I'll be able to maybe write a blog or start a website. So I'm constantly looking for ways to get the information out, even as I'm doing the research.
Well, Geoff, thank you so much for meeting with me today. It was a privilege to get to talk to you, and thank you for making archaeology accessible.
You're welcome.
Historic Bethabara Park is both a National Historic District and a public city park. Park grounds are open year-round from dawn till dusk. Guided tours are available during visitor center open hours. Moravian Mornings is a production of Historic Bethabara Park. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, shoot the Moravian Mornings team an email at historicbethabarapark@gmail.com. For open hours, information about our events, programs, exhibits, and resources about the Moravians in North Carolina, visit our website at historicbethabarapark.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Come visit the birthplace of Winston-Salem in person at 2147 Bethabara Road, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27106.